Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the IAS Thursdays event, Nationalizing News Environment, Causes and Consequences. My name is Bianette Castellanos, Chair of American Studies and Director of the Institute for Advanced Study. I am a brown-skinned woman with dark hair wearing glasses with black frames. IAS Thursdays is a regular event series that brings a wide range of ideas, conversations, and viewpoints to the heart of the University of Minnesota and is designed for scholars from all walks of life. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that wherever you are joining us from today, we're all located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus is located on Dakota land, ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The IAS acknowledges that this place has a complex and layered history. This land acknowledgement is one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus about this land and our relationships with it and each other. The IAS is committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. Next week, I hope you will join us for a very special IAS Thursday event celebrating Jennifer Gunn's tenure as director. She and I will spend a little time discussing the future of what it means to do interdisciplinary work and how collaborations with both internal and external partners can help us build a just university together. Following the event, we will gather in the Northrop Gallery for a reception. We also have a number of exciting opportunities available. The deadline to apply for a new or renewing research and creative collaborative funding is October 10th. Budgets of up to $12,000 are available. Also, Imagine Fund Special Events Grants proposals, which fund activities related to the arts, humanities, and design, and which also feature a significant public engagement component, are due on October 17th. Finally, graduate students take note. Applications for interdisciplinary doctoral fellowships are now open, and those interested in applying to join the IAS cohort should submit applications by October 17th. We are hosting an information session this Friday at 10:30 a.m. with several other IDF sponsoring centers. More information on these opportunities and others can be found on the IAS website. Those interested in receiving information about upcoming events, funding, and program offerings can sign up for our newsletter, visit our website to sign up, or check the chat for the link to sign up, which is z.umn.edu/IAS-newsletter. I also want to offer a few technical instructions for our audience members. All IAS Thursdays, including this one, include cart captioning. You can enable captions by clicking on the closed caption live transcription button, commonly located in the bottom Zoom menu bar if you are on a desktop computer, or in the top right menu if you're on a mobile device. Then select Show Subtitles. We will have time for audience questions at the end of the event. If you have questions for our speakers at any time during today's presentation, you can enter them through Zoom's Q&A feature, which is also located on Zoom's menu bar. To introduce yourselves and share resources throughout the event, we recommend using the chat feature. Please be sure to select all panelists and attendees when you send your message. And now, without any further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce today's guest. Johanna Dunaway is a professor of political science at Texas A&M University. Her areas of research and teaching include news, media, and politics and political communication, with an emphasis on how the changing media environment is shaping news consumption and political knowledge, attitudes, and behavior. She is a co-author of several books, including Homestyle Opinion, How Local Newspapers Can Slow Polarization, with Joshua Darr and Matthew Hitt, and News Attention in a Mobile Era with Kathleen Searles. She is at work on a book still in progress, The House That Fox News Built, Representation, Political Accountability, and the Rise of Partisan News, co-authored with Kevin Arsenault, Martin Johnson, and Ryan Vanderwielen. Moderating today's conversation is Daniel Myers, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Minnesota. He studies political communication and political psychology, particularly as they relate to political polarization and theories of deliberative democracy. Dan is currently a residential fellow here with us at the Institute for Advanced Study and is working on the project When No Politics Are Local, How the Nationalization of News Consumption Changed Politics for Americans. Welcome and take it away.
Hi, thank you. Let me just share my screen before I begin. Okay, can everyone see that all right? My name is Johanna Dunaway, as we were just learning. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm a short, pale white woman in her, well, I'll not specify the range of the 40s that I'm in, but I'm in the 40s. I have dark brown hair and blonde streaks, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. And you've already heard, I guess, everything else about me in terms of professional credentials, but I'm delighted to be here and get a chance to visit with you today. Even if our visit is virtual, we can still enjoy this time together and hopefully have an interesting conversation. So earlier today, we had some of us attended a talk based on Dan's work. Dan gave a talk, and part of the festivities today, or the events today, are kind of a longer series. So part of it's a public event and part of it was a smaller event. And Dan talked a lot about this project that he's working on that we can talk about a little bit later. And some of his work was kind of building directly on my work and some work that several other people in the field are also doing about this kind of relationship between what we are referring to as the nationalization of the news environment and mainly things like polarization, but also declining rates of participation and political knowledge and things like that at the local level. So I'm just going to give a little bit of background on some of that work to sort of get you up to speed with the conversation. And then towards the end of the talk, I'll try to relate some of this, this broader area of work to some of the newer work on affective polarization in particular, and talk about what I think that means for where the kind of future research should go or is going, and also tie it back to some of the work that Dan was talking about earlier. So if I refer to Dan's talk earlier or Dan's project, that's sort of what I'm referring to, just so you'll have the full context for those of you that weren't there today. But it won't be too in the weeds of that stuff, so it shouldn't present a problem for anyone who wasn't here earlier today. Okay, so you've all probably heard at least pundits or maybe journalists or even politicians talking about the problems that local news have been facing for a while. And in case you haven't, I'll talk to you a little bit about that. This first paper that I'm going to talk about briefly basically looked at whether when local news declines or disappears, as in the case here in this map, where you see how many newspapers kind of basically went out of business, closed their doors, or got absorbed, or what have you, between the years of 2000 and 2014. And this is just kind of one indicator of the bigger challenges that the news industry has been facing pretty much since the arrival of cable, but it's only gotten more intense and more problematic for the media more generally in an economic sense since the arrival of the internet. And then you can sort of think about social media and smartphones arriving as second and third waves of the internet, for lack of a better way to put it. And each of those waves has meant sort of even more problems for what we usually call the traditional media environment. Mainly, it's just that they've faced increasing levels of competition from all these different outlets, but also those different kinds of outlets, whether it's cable, the internet, social media, or all those things, but on your smartphone. Basically, what that did was kind of expand the options of choice that people had all the time for what they could consume, whether it's entertainment or news or whatever. And it has meant that people are no longer kind of tethered to their local newspaper or even their local television news. And it's also meant that the news environment is no longer really restricted by geography like it used to be. So for example, for those of you who are only living in a world where local news has never been a big deal, to learn about local sports teams or the local weather, you used to have to tune to your local station and watch a local news program to catch that information, or read the local paper. You couldn't just go online and find that information somewhere very easily. So a bunch of the content that we used to kind of want about local stuff was also bundled with national stuff. And people would watch national news in also a more restricted way or read about it by either subscribing to a national paper or watching a national news program. But those were kind of separate. Both were available locally, but over time, has the kind of geography of politics has become separate from the geography of news, because all levels of news are available everywhere. And even as someone living in Texas, I can figure out the local news in Seattle just by going online. That has meant all sorts of economic problems for the media, as I said, but also some kind of confusing things in terms of politics and the way politics at the national level and the local level are covered by the media. So one of the things that we've seen is that this was at first kind of thought by many to be problematic, but kind of in circles of people interested in journalism and media and democracy, like researchers, maybe journalists, some pundits. But even then, it wasn't clear what the big problem was, because there was always, as soon as the internet arrived, for example, people were ready to argue that the internet was going to democratize the information environment. And we didn't need to worry that local newspapers were hurting or disappearing or going out of business, because people could find anything they wanted on the internet. And so people also assumed that these local web native websites would pop up and provide all this comprehensive local news. And the whole information environment would be democratized, because it would no longer be top down, where editors were kind of telling us what we should focus on. But as it turns out, a lot of those things didn't really happen. And so we've been left with where local news has disappeared. It's kind of like there's nothing equivalent to it to fill the gap. But people were still thinking, oh, I'm just not sure there's a big problem there. But as researchers began sort of studying this more in depth, we learned more systematically that other forms of local media weren't filling in those gaps. We also kind of were reminded by various research, but also, there are kind of like newspaper groups and journalism groups and university centers that study these sorts of things, kind of reminding us that, hey, look, yes, there's cable news on TV and there's national news on TV and there's these other forms of media, but a lot of the information that they tell us and give us and put on their websites, or that these, the Huffington Post or HuffPost puts on their website, comes from reporting that actually newspaper reporters around the country did all day. So they're still kind of the backbone of news provision, even if that's not immediately obvious based on how news is delivered. Even when we get news on social media, that comes from somewhere, and often a lot of it is coming from local newspaper reporting. But every time we lose newspapers or those newspaper staffs shrink, we have few of those people doing that kind of work, and fewer of those people developing the specialties they need to be experts in doing that kind of work. So we're losing that expertise, and that kind of core infrastructure is kind of another thing to be worried about. There are also really big differences between local newspapers and local TV news. So another thing people sort of said when they were saying, so what, was local TV news can cover these things. Well, relatively speaking, local TV news has been pretty healthy compared to newspapers. But once you put in the weather, the traffic, and the sports and the commercials, that leaves about 2 minutes for anything related to like policy or governance or anything. And a lot of local TV stations are in these bigger media markets that cover lots of different political jurisdictions, like counties, cities, towns. And that 2 minutes doesn't provide nearly enough time to cover all of these things in any detail. Whereas a local newspaper has a little bit more space and depth and personnel to cover more of that stuff. So just structurally, in terms of the way the local TV news broadcast works, it just can't provide news in the same way. And as I already mentioned, local web natives websites haven't really emerged. There are a few, but they either don't attract hardly any audiences, even enough to register on most of the metrics that the companies that track these things don't even count them because they attract so few audiences, or there might be a few that are there, but they only post content like every 3 or 4 days. It's very spotty, not reliable, or it's inaccurate and unprofessional, not well vetted, things like that. So there's all kinds of problems, but the main problem is no one's there. And if they are there, no one's watching or listening. So no one's going to these sites. And a guy named Matt Heineman has done a ton of work on this and shows it pretty convincingly. And then for those local newspaper sites that are there, and the ones that are there and sticking around, or local news sites, are the ones that are basically the TV news stations, their websites are there. And then local newspapers have websites, and that's great. But even those aren't generating the revenue. It's the TV form and the print form. And it's because to make money off the internet, you have to have people stay on the page longer. And local news websites, even as they've innovated and improved drastically over time, they aren't sticky enough. They aren't keeping people on the page long enough to earn revenue for the news organization. So news organizations have had to adapt to also have a digital staff to create these web content, these websites with content and update it all the time. And they're much, much better at it now. But even then, it's not quite replacing the revenue models. So the economic problems persist, even though things are improving on the digital side in a lot of ways. So basically, as these news staffs all over the country and newspapers are kind of shrinking, and probably news staffs in local TV are also shrinking, and all their budgets are shrinking, and then many of the papers themselves are disappearing. One of the arguments that people have made, or one of the things people have been concerned about, is whether the news environment is nationalizing. And that's partly because as we lose these local sources, either because people just prefer national news and now they can get it anytime, or because their local newspaper has disappeared, or because now it's terrible because there's only 3 reporters, people tend to default back to just national forms of news, mainly TV news, cable, maybe broadcast, but mainly TV news or web forms of news. Okay. And, that's what we mean when we say the news is nationalizing. We mean that people are just kind of going back to national media outlets as their primary sources of news, relying on those most of the time as their sources of information. Okay. So why do we care about that? Well, you might think, no big deal. At least people are still paying attention. And that's true. People are paying attention. For those people who don't just quit watching news altogether, the fact that they are watching it somewhere or listening to it or reading it somewhere is a good thing. But there's a lot of sort of problems associated with the fact that when people turn to national news and forget to keep following local news in whatever form they can get it. Several trends sort of have been identified that are problematic, that are associated with this nationalization thing. So one is that, and this one's kind of the obvious one, I think, but people just know a lot less about local politics or regional politics, even at the state level politics. They don't know what's happening with their state legislatures or their city councils or their mayors. And as a result of that, they don't participate at high rates. And they already weren't participating at super high rates, but that problem gets worse when you kind of remove the knowledge base, because people don't like to go vote if they really don't know who they're voting for or why. And because people are not participating or paying as much attention at the local level, this is not gone unnoticed by local leaders and people running for office. So it tends to reduce political accountability in many ways. And it also can inspire some shenanigans like political corruption, because if a local newspaper isn't there to kind of monitor the behavior of the city council or the city manager or the mayor or whoever, they will behave as if they're not being watched, because they know that there's no one sort of communicating those behaviors to the voters. Maybe their opponents in the next election cycle or something like that, but people may or may not find the opponent credible, or they may not pay attention to the campaign, all sorts of things. So we see those kinds of things. We also see kind of just declining levels of political competition, probably as a consequence of people not being as engaged and informed and participating as much. But one of the things people have been really worried about is that as voters begin to only really follow the national news, that kind of removes a common basis of shared, I guess, not grievances, but sort of concerns or bonds that we might have with our neighbor or other community members about what's going on with us locally. And it makes people, when they think about politics, not really think anymore about things like their kids' school or the local health system or the infrastructure. They start thinking about things in terms of the way that the national media talks about them, which is way more about the battles between the two parties than it is about kind of bread and butter issues that most people face on a daily basis. And so that in turn means that local representatives, whether it's city councils or governors or House rep members representing local districts, if the people aren't worried about these bread and butter, more locally salient issues, then they aren't going to perform on those issues because they know that people aren't watching and the media aren't watching, or the media aren't talking about the way they've responded to some concern in the district or in the city. So if I'm a House member and I, in the olden days, would have gotten a lot of credit for bringing a new industry into my district and getting a lot of jobs for my district, now that there's no newspaper around to talk about that or local media to really talk about that, and I can't use that to claim credit, I'm going to talk about something else, which is, what the national media is going to pay attention to. So maybe I'm going to make some big statement about how all Democrats are doing this or all Republicans are doing that, because that's likely to get favor from my party leaders, but also might get me some media attention. So a researcher in our field named Mark Trussler has sort of made this argument that as the media environment has expanded and gotten more national and people have abandoned those kind of local sources, it's reduced the accountability or the ability that we as local citizens have to hold our local leaders accountable. So that's a big problem. And so we know that in a lot of ways, national newspapers and national TV programs, national news programs, just don't really substitute well, or at least in all the ways they could, for declining local newspapers. So democratic accountability suffers. And like I said, we've seen these, lots of studies have shown things that people perform better in office. They're more responsive to their constituents. They're less corrupt, all of these things when there's local newspapers around. Local newspapers tend to be more trusted because people kind of follow them habitually. So, for example, declining or trust in the media has been declining for a while. One hypothesis floating around out there right now is that maybe one reason that's so is because now that people are following the national media at higher rates, those media are not trusted as well as local media. And so that could be one reason that declining trust or media trust altogether is declining. So we just, don't have that kind of local touchstone to sort of tell us things and help us hold our leaders' feet to the fire, so to speak. And the other thing is that when people switch to reading local newspapers or watching national broadcasts about national level news, it's just different in many respects. But one of them is that it's just a lot more partisan. It's a lot more about those party elites fighting about various policy issues, saying sort of hostile things. We did a study on this a few years ago where we looked to see whether the elites that basically were the partisan elites in Congress who were invited on cable news programs and broadcast TV news programs to see whether they were the more extreme members of Congress. And it turns out that they were. And the cable outlets were particularly bad about this, but even the broadcast networks did it. So it wasn't just like the partisan networks doing it, it was all of them. And it's probably something about the economic model where they think, oh, we'll bring these like more extreme, more colorful guests on the program. It'll rile everyone up. But the thing that it ends up happening is that it sort of highlights the more extreme ends of the parties at the elite level. It's either the party leaders who tend to be more partisan and more polarized, or it's the uncivil and kind of extreme position taking, or they'll invite them both on and let them, have conflict on air, which is also something that attracts ratings, but that is off-putting from the standpoint of the viewer. But I think most importantly is that it probably fuels this idea of partisan stereotypes in most of our minds. So, when we are only seeing the most extreme version of the elite party members in Congress, then we start to only think of those exemplars when we think about the party. Dan has some other work that focuses on this that I just happened to see at a recent conference. And we know that people do have these like party stereotypes in their head. So here it's very tiny, you probably can't see that well, but what we basically showed in that paper was just that as you go to the more extreme, these are the, as you go to the higher levels of extremity for these various members, they are more likely to get more guest appearances on these different channels. And that pattern exists differently, but to some extent for all these different networks we're showing here. So we know this is an issue, okay? We know that this kind of news is just different in terms of it having more polarizing content on it, or what we would expect to be more polarizing content. So this made us kind of think, okay, well, if that's true, maybe the shift to national news is going to mean that people are going to start becoming even more polarized. So we set out to test this question. And what we really wanted to know was whether when these local newspapers die or close their doors and go away, does it mean that people start watching more national news? And as a result, do we see them voting in a more polarized way? By that, we basically just meant, do people straight ticket vote more often? So you just click the Democrat button or the Republican button because you're a partisan and that's just how you vote, and you don't even have to think about it because you know so well that those are the candidates that you want. And so we looked at that at the community level. And so we basically did this kind of matching design where we looked to see if whether once a newspaper died, if during the next cycles, we could see more straight ticket voting happening. And we compared communities that looked a lot like the communities that had lost their newspaper to those that didn't. And we didn't see the same pattern in the communities that did not lose their newspaper. So this was kind of an effect we only observed for those cities who did lose their local newspaper. And we're not the only ones who found something similar. So there's another well-known paper that also found a similar pattern and had, and it came out, I don't know, a year or two after ours, but like very similar results, slightly different explanation about why. I think his paper might have not been looking at newspaper deaths, but was looking at something about local TV news and the switch from local TV news to national. But even looking at that instead, same result, more straight ticket voting as a result. So this has been sort of supported by other work in the literature as well. So, we just were like, okay, well then, we're already worried about local newspapers going away or less reliance on local news content. So polarization, I guess, is one more thing that we can add to that list of concerns, which is not great news, right? And then what happened from that point was sort of interesting. I'm not sure if it's because, the way our paper made things sound, it was like, oh, one reason everyone's getting more polarized is because local newspapers are declining. Well, that of course makes the importance of newspapers really, that sends a strong signal about newspapers being important. So the media really got excited about our paper and covered it a lot. And I mean, political scientists, our work doesn't get covered as much as you would think. So this was like really got a ton of coverage, which I'm only pointing out because as a result of that coverage, this editor of the Palm Springs Desert Sun wrote an op-ed one day saying that she had read our paper and as a result wanted to the question occurred to her, well, what if in our paper we covered less national news? Would that have a depolarizing effect, or would we see less polarization? So we didn't even know about this. She wrote this op-ed and mentioned our names, and we had Google alerts on ourselves because everyone does. And so we found out that she was going to do this, and her plan was to stop putting any national politics on the op-ed page in her newspaper for an entire month. And this was in 2019, I think. So we got the Google alert and we were like, oh, this is a real opportunity for an experiment. So once we found out they were going to do this, we quickly tried to get everything together so that we could do a pre-test survey or a pre-experimental survey and then a post survey to see if we could compare a similar community that didn't have this stoppage of national content on the op-ed page, and to see if we could see differences in the rates of polarization based on that basically halting of exposure to national content. And this was a really conservative test because it was only on the op-ed page. So they didn't take all the national coverage out of the rest of the newspaper, just the op-ed page. And they did this. Julie Mackinnon was the editor who decided to do this. And our experimental design was basically just to give surveys before and after that month to both communities. We had a representative sample, and then they also did reader surveys. And our comparison community was Ventura. They're both Gannett papers, so we thought that was also one other way they could be the same. While we looked at this one big difference, it gave us a little bit more control. And basically, what we found, we know that the readers noticed because that came through in the reader surveys. So we know that the treatment had its effect, like they, or was noticed by the people who were exposed to the paper. And we basically expected that maybe we would see less polarization in the community, Palm Springs, where they hadn't seen national content on the op-ed page for a month. But we also thought some things would matter. So this effect should be stronger among those who prefer newspapers, who have higher rates of political knowledge, and who participate in politics. Okay, so we found, we pre-registered all of this on Open Science and put these hypotheses out there and then ran the tests. And we basically found not quite that there was a depolarizing effect or a stoppage of polarization, but what we found was that it slowed down. So where the rates of affective polarization and social polarization kind of grew more steeply or increased more rapidly during this period of time for the untreated community, in our community, that process was slowed down, or the treated community of Palm Springs. So, you know, nothing like a reduction, it doesn't go away, but at least polarization didn't kind of keep growing. And it was a pretty polarizing month. Like a bunch of things were going on. We were having all kinds of things related to the lead up to the 2020 election. And many, many polarizing things were happening in our politics at the time. So that rate that you saw for Ventura was actually probably normally not going to be that high. But still, without being exposed to a lot of the national coverage, that slope was a lot less steep on the Palm Springs side. And when we went back and did a content analysis to look at how different the content looked, and there was, you know, way more coverage of Trump, for example, in the op-ed page of the Ventura County Star, all during that month. So, you know, I mean, everyone knows whether they like Trump or dislike Trump. Trump is a pretty polarizing figure, right? So just the removal of his presence probably made a big difference. But there was really no national content, and that content was replaced by stuff about local and regional issues. So it actually played out, you know, sort of how we thought, even if our findings were a little bit more nuanced than we might have initially anticipated. Okay, so why is it important to think about this? Why does this matter that there's this relationship between affective polarization or polarization in general and a nationalizing news environment? Well, I think, you know, we've highlighted lots of reasons why it might be important, but there's some really new work, forthcoming work, and then some recently released work on affective polarization that really highlights some of the problems that it's possibly creating in society. And among those are, I should back up for a second and say this. There's kind of a debate about how much we should worry about it, right? So there's one camp that kind of says, okay, we know affective polarization has these social consequences, like nobody wants their kid to marry somebody of the other party. Nobody wants to sit at Thanksgiving dinner with somebody of the other party and talk about it. People don't want to live in neighborhoods with people of the other party, all of this kind of thing. But researchers have had trouble demonstrating like explicitly political consequences. However, that's really not true, because I mean, that is true, but if you look kind of more carefully at the work on affective polarization, and especially this new work, you can see that there are subsets of people that are really high on affective polarization. They have really high levels of dislike for the other party, who, when they're asked questions about the kinds of political behaviors they will engage in and why they will engage in those behaviors, it's clear that they're placing partisanship over the best of the country or over policy priorities that they used to have. They're even willing to cast aside democratic norms if it means their party will win, right? So like, change this electoral law just so my party can win, break this rule, get rid of this, get rid of that. And it's partisans on both sides when they're asked these various questions and scenarios. But it's only those people that are in a really special class of really high levels of partisan dislike of that out party, okay? So even though there's this kind of debate, we do know that at least for a subset of people, these things can really change the way they are orienting towards the political process, where it's almost like partisanship and party identity has become more important even than democracy itself under certain conditions. And so that's kind of what people are worrying about. And so this new work on that's coming out, that's not out yet, that I'm was asked to read for review purposes, so I can't really talk about who the authors are, but they offer a conditional theory of affective polarization, where they say they're trying to kind of explain the conditions under which affective polarization really matters. And they say that basically how much you dislike the other party dictates how much you use motivated reasoning to make decisions about all sorts of things, even if it's about the acceptance of democratic norms, or following the law, or deciding to conduct violence against a partisan on the other side or something like that. It can be pretty extreme in some of the examples. But they say it basically governs the extent to which party motivates you to do all sorts of things. And so they basically argue that those people with really high levels of animosity will be especially likely to be governed by partisanship above other considerations. But that means that but they say it's conditional on the environment and how strong the party signals are. So when parties are behaving very differently and very polarized, it's clear to these people which way they should go if they were going to follow party motivations, so they do so. That means that as the environment gets more polarized, these people are going to more and more often behave in ways that are governed by partisanship, okay? But if we were in a moment of low polarization, then maybe we wouldn't see those behaviors that often. The other thing that they say in their conditional theory is that partisan animus can be overridden by the need for like accuracy or I guess true information when the person perceives that there's direct personal consequences and like tangible things that you might suffer. So if thinking of something like the pandemic, like if you were really worried about COVID and you thought your family or yourself would be threatened, then you might actually pay attention to information without thinking about it through a partisan lens. You would just look for the true information so you knew what to do, right? It's at least in the condition of it not being polarized yet. So let's think maybe early in the pandemic. So those kinds of conditions, in those conditions, these people or all people of all levels, they're going to put animus aside, even whatever level they have, because the immediate consequences of these policy considerations or whatever else are going to make them focus on that and the importance of that instead. Okay, so it's conditioned by both the polarization in the environment and how kind of immediate and relevant to your own personal life the policy considerations at hand are. The other thing, this other recent work that came out, this is the work that's already out by Jana Krupnikoff and John Barry Ryan. They basically talk about how a big divide in politics is basically how super involved some people are. And those people, they say, are way more likely to be these people that are high in partisan animus or dislike for the other side. They also find, and like some of Dan's work talks about, these people, it's more that they hold these strong stereotypes about the other party and those are usually based on exposure they have to partisan elites, than it is about how they feel about regular partisans. So when people are asked about partisans and how they like them, they think of Nancy Pelosi or Donald Trump or these, these big players in the two parties. They don't think about their neighbor who's a party, supports the other party. But what they found through the course of all these questions and things that they asked is that these people who have these really high levels of partisan animus partly feel that way because they hold these stereotypes, but they're also the ones that are hardest to shake from having those stereotypes. And so until we can get people to, they sort of argue that until we can get people to like really look at regular partisans as regular partisans and quit letting them be so exposed to these extreme versions of partisans, that this is going to continue to be a problem. So basically, exposure to really partisan elites all the time is a problem. And Dan's work and others, I think, shows that one way we form stereotypes about partisans is through media exposure, and especially under conditions where we are constantly being shown the most partisan elites. So here we are back to the problem of the nationalizing news environment. So one of the critiques that Dan makes in his paper, I don't know if you actually said this during your talk earlier today, Dan, but the talk I mentioned earlier, but in the paper, you mentioned that even though we know now that the nationalizing news environment is really related to affective polarization or polarization, but we don't really know the mechanism of that. Well, I think this work, all this newer work on affective polarization, plus the work that we've just talked about, kind of suggests 4 ways that the nationalizing news environment might be exacerbating these problems, or this is sort of the processes through which it might be happening. By shifting the focus to the political domain where the intensity and frequency of partisan cues is much higher, the national stage, the national media, it removes the focus from the immediately relevant, direct bread and butter concerns of most Americans. So direct personal consequences become less apparent. It also shifts the focus to these highly partisan elites, whether it's the leaders or whether it's the ones who are highly partisan because they're highly polarized and have more extreme positions. The nationalizing news environment basically does all of these things and sort of sets the stage for the conditions under which these other researchers are saying partisan animus becomes a big problem. So these might be some of the mechanisms underlying those processes. And so depending on the levels of partisan animus that different people have and the polarization level in the environment, the nationalization of the news might be really shaping our understanding of what and who is political, whether we care about policy consequences or whether we just care about those, is my party winning or not, that party gamesmanship, or whether we will negotiate and entertain compromise, or if we're just going to reject compromise just for the sake of trying to punish the other side and not show ourselves as cooperating with the other side and therefore somehow validating them. So that's what I basically wanted to kind of share, bring you to the where I think the research is kind of all headed and how it relates to some of Dan's work and then this work that we've been doing. So I guess questions are welcome, but I guess Dan's going to take it from here as moderator, and you guys will do this through Zoom. So I will quit sharing my screen. And thank you for your attention.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that talk, and I think that gives a really hopeful overview of sort of where we are. This is obviously always a little bit of a depressing topic to present about, because there's not much good news in news, particularly when we're talking about trends in local news, but even as we think about how those interplay with trends in national news. So I just wanted to put a couple of questions out there, either for you to respond to now or just to serve as prompts for further discussion. So I think one of the other interesting things that's going on with news consumption over this period is of course the sort of and you allude to this when you allude to Yana Krupnikov and John Barry Ryan's work. It's not just the audience for news is changing in that we have a lot of people who are not at all engaged in news, and we have a small number of people who are extremely engaged in news. And just, I would guess if you're in the audience for a talk like this, you're probably in the latter category of people who are extremely engaged in news. And so how does that either help contribute to this drive away from local news, in the pressure away from local news, or how does that become maybe partially a consequence of the decline of local news? Is part of the problem that there's just less out there that's of immediate interest to people, and so they disengage from political news in general. So I started by saying how it's always kind of a depressing topic to talk about, because one question I have is about sort of the practices of journalism that we see patterned in these different kinds of outlets. In the sort of technological and market forces that have done so much damage to local news are probably not going to change. Unfortunately, and so I'd like to say that we can all just go out and support your local newspaper and that'll help, but it's probably not enough. But are there patterns or practices of journalism that were features of local news sort of before the fall that can be adopted at a national level and bring some of those features to the national level? Obviously, the local news, the New York Times or CNN is not going to be reporting on your local city council meeting, but are there other things that are different across these that might help ameliorate some of the harm that's done by this nationalization of news? The final question I have is a little bit of a normative question, and this always struck me as a little bit of a paradox in the literature, but we have a lot of these consequences that are produced by the unbundling of media. So people, if you want to know what's going on with the Twins or with whatever your local sports team of choice are, you no longer have to get the whole newspaper and page through that whole newspaper. And so that's sort of an interesting paradox, and we've granted people a much greater media freedom. And it's produced these terrible consequences for democracy. And so I don't know how we get around that. In some ways, as a media, someone who thinks about political media, I want to pass a law that makes people sit on their couches and read the newspaper for the whole thing for half an hour, or force them all to watch national network news like they used to in the 1950s, and that was the only thing on TV. But that seems like not a solution. So are there sort of habits of citizens or ways to think about our freedom as media consumers that we could perhaps contribute to solving some of these problems? So thank you for your talk. And if I'm correct here, we can open it up to Q&A, so folks can put the questions and in using the Q&A feature in Zoom, And Joanna, I don't know if you wanted to say anything in response. Will we queue up some questions?
Sure. So on the last point, yeah, I don't. So this is where I think on actually your last 2 points, this is where I think we really need to do more comparative research to look at other kinds of media systems and how they interact with like the institutional structures of our governments, because there are places where people are both more informed and don't have rising levels of affective polarization. And we just know very little about like the roots of these problems and like what are the different cultural and political arrangements and settings that exacerbate them. And it's difficult to study, and that's one reason why. But that's one way that we actually might know at least conditions that are less likely to foster this. And some media systems aren't as driven by profits and things like that, which is part of the problem, as you noted, that there's like an incentive problem. Even Facebook's model, the reason that they changed their algorithm to make everyone be outrageous to get likes, I mean, that's because the more people stay on the page, the more money they get. And so even like newer media models are still this basic like economic model of, sure, it might be clicks or time on the page instead of eyeballs like ratings were, but it's the same underlying economic logic. Until we sort of understand the degree to which that is driving a lot of this, at least on the journalism side, and we know it is, but like we can't even look at we need to look at other models comparatively to see what else could work. I mean, now changing the whole media system may also not be realistic, but if we knew for sure that certain ownership types, for example, or certain market combinations, we could, there could be some kind of regulations that might help, right? So those are the kinds of things that I think might help us at least get to the right answer. If that answers part of those questions. I'm not sure.
Yeah, thanks. And so we can open this up for Q&A from the audience. And as that goes along,
I forgot what the first question was.
Yeah, the first question was about this sort of this stratification of political interest in news.
Oh,
and yeah, and so part of what's going on here is not just the shift from national to local, but the shift from everybody consuming a little bit of news to some people consuming way too much news, and most people consuming very little news. Yeah. How does that how is that part of the cause of or consequence of this nationalization trend?
I think some of what we know about that particular thing actually goes back to Marcus Pryor's book, because he talks about how this is a book from 2007, I think, for audience members who aren't familiar with it. He basically argues that as media choice started to expand, first through cable, then through the internet, people, a lot of them who aren't that interested suddenly had all these other things to watch. Okay, we all, that part of the argument, sure. But like what he says is, as a result, those people became less informed and therefore less likely to participate. So then we're left with only those more stronger partisan and kind of more extreme people left in the political system. So a whole bunch of moderate people, because they were a little bit less interested in news and they could always now watch Cartoon Network or something else, HGTV, just kind of dropped out of the system altogether, leaving it to be the more of these highly interested people or deeply involved, I think, to use Krupnikoff and Ryan's work. Now, to be clear, I think they actually have their typology a little bit wrong, because they combine a lot of elements in their definition that I don't think should be combined, because I think they're separate dimensions of expression and these other psychological needs and stuff. So I'm not saying I think they have 100% of it right, but I do think that there is a clear divide between the people they identify and everyone else. I just think that there's more nuance within that group they identify, where not all the people in that group have these super polarizing traits or super polarized traits. You can be highly involved and care a lot and constantly monitor the political world and still not have really strong feelings of partisan dislike for out parties. So there's more people in that group that I think aren't contributing to the problem. But there is sort of a trade-off, it seems like, where we either have a world in which we have lots of involvement, but that involvement is turning into like an obsession that borderlines on unhealthy, to the world that we thought we were in, like in the late 70s or early 70s, maybe mid 70s, where we thought parties were too weak and everyone was super apathetic and nobody was informed and our democracy was lackluster. So surely it doesn't have to just be one or the other, but we need to try to figure out how to get to that place. And a lot of the problem with the rising polarization at the elite level, and just now, it seems like the worse it gets, the more it feeds into the problem just getting worse, because then you're just seeing more of these stereotypes of this bad behavior and extreme rhetoric and stuff. And then that's kind of, I don't know which direction the cycle is going, but it does seem to be self-reinforcing.
And so we've got a question about so the question is, what role do you think that late night TV, so things like The Daily Show or Last Week Tonight, have on our news consumption and about these sort of political processes? And you know, I remember a time when I was in college and The Daily Show with Jon Stewart was a huge thing, and that certainly projected a particular kind of politics. So yeah, what role do you think that kind of not exactly news programming, but not news programming plays?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. There was a bunch of research, like in the heyday of Jon Stewart and The Daily Show, people did a bunch of research sort of trying to see if there were cynicism effects kind of breeding from it. And then other people studied whether it was educating people, which I think both might have been true to some extent. But John Oliver and Jon Stewart both, I think, not that they're the only two in this category, but I think they're both pretty popular. There's cynicism there, but there's also a lot of optimism there, really. So I think probably the most convincing finding that came out of most of that work was that people can learn from it. I don't think there was as much evidence of cynicism coming from it as people thought. And my guess is that the reason for that is that there might have been, like, if you tested people right after they watched it, maybe you would pick up a little, but then that would fade. I think maybe that's not the kind of media effect that would stick longer term. But that's just my guess. And the other thing I'll say is that probably we should recheck, because I wonder if now there's a slightly different flavor to it, or if maybe because people are more polarized, there would be different responses. Because I don't know a lot of more really recent work that has looked at those kinds of questions and those kinds of shows, because they reach a big audience. So
yeah. So we have a question about diversity in news, and so there's been a push to diversify voices in at least national news production, and I think we have seen a little bit at some of that at the local level. You know, there's been at least some talk about that in our local newspaper here, the Star Tribune. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts on whether that diversification might alter this trajectory?
That's a great question. I mean, it depends, I think, and this is me speculating, but I think it would depend on those new perspectives and different types of people coming in as reporters, different gender, different sex identity, different race, different ethnicity. if that new sort of mixture of people that would be the more diverse newsroom ended up shifting the model of journalism a little bit, then maybe. But some of the research that we do have on this, which is limited, but some of that research shows almost that because of the professional training you get as a journalist, it almost kind of socializes out of you your other identities when you're doing your reporting, so that like, and also there's like work culture stuff that's not very healthy probably, that makes people feel not comfortable being advocates, let's say for maybe their identity group or something like that. Like, so people tend to still follow those same norms and routines of journalism, even though they come from a totally different perspective, and they might prefer a different model, but they don't feel like they can change it from within. And as I'm thinking of like 1 or 2 studies, so this has not been studied very well, but I think at least one possibility is that there wouldn't be much luck shifting the journalism model over. However, the journalism model has to shift kind of, because otherwise it's in real trouble. So, and there are these kind of anecdotal stories of especially younger, newer journalists entering the newsroom. They're pushing back on whether everything has to be objective, because objectivity brings its own set of problems. And there may be, it's almost like they're pushing more for like a civic journalism sort of model where there can be a little bit of advocacy in there. Now, all that's debatable about whether that should be happen or not. But if it did, it might shift the model away from this kind of straight profit model where sensationalism and outrage drive so many of the decisions of the newsroom. So I would say it's possible. It's just not clear based on what we know so far, what we might like learn from an increasingly diverse newsroom. I still think we need to have that happen for lots of other reasons, but it would be really nice if it also happened to address some of these problems.
And I'll just ask a follow-up question on that. And so, you know, obviously, again, focus on the negative consequences of nationalization, but is there a possible positive consequence here of exposure to national news instead of to just your local news, exposing more people to more diversity and to a broader spectrum of America than they might have or encounter in their local community? Is there anything to suggest or that might be a positive consequence that's happening?
I think that's a sound logic, and I think it could be a good thing, but there's a difference between news nationalizing broadly and focusing on a lot of America versus it nationalizing it in just the political sense. I think we've been focused on, you know, kind of everything becoming about Washington politics. So from that, I don't see a lot of positive. But like, if we were to just think about whether seeing more aspects of like Americans being hit by like these climate change related disasters or poverty in different parts of America, or challenges of like crime and people experiencing homelessness and like hunger, different things like that. If we saw that from more places and saw that different kinds of people were experiencing it, I could see that that would have positive like effects for people understanding empathy to more different types of people. Yeah, I think quite possibly. I think that's, I don't know that nationalizing news also entails that kind of thing, but I also don't know that it would offset the negative of the Washington politics part of the broadcast, you know. but it's a great question. Like that we should think more broadly about what the rest of the news program means, because probably if they're watching, I'm trying to think of one of their names, Lester Holt, you know, in the evening news, they're probably going to watch the whole 30 minutes. So whatever that other coverage is really might have some positive aspects to it.
And so this is a question about the sort of local digital native, there has been a fair amount of energy of sort of very civic-minded people trying to set up um, new startups, sometimes with a profit-based business model, sometimes with just a sort of let's get people to start covering local meetings.
Mhm.
And I mean, I'm old enough to remember what Wired magazine looked like in the 1990s, when the internet was going to free us all and make everything perfect.
Mhm.
um, is there anything to that, at least from the political accountability standpoint, that those sort of outlets could provide, um, and maybe even if they aren't reaching a huge audience, can they fill some of that gap in terms of um, you know, making it less likely that local officials will engage in corruption and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I do think so. There are specialty outlets that are emerging that have had some success, right? So ProPublica is one that's a good example, and it's like a cooperation between public media and it's a nonprofit, and they've done some great investigative reporting. And like you could imagine a model that did, like you could imagine an organization that wanted to just start tracking city council meetings all over the country and like monitoring those. And I like that kind of model. I could see having success, actually really stopping some corruption and all that. It's still a little different than what we would get from having that local news monitor on a geographic basis. And because they might, you know, watch the city council and stave off like corruption from whatever cities they decided. But like, for one thing, how many cities, how much spread, like that would be a difficult model in some ways. But something that starts from a narrower, like institutional or policy lens that just isn't supposed to be local about this town or this city, that still might be more viable, because it might be able to have a different kind of structural arrangement or a nonprofit status that's different from what a news outlet would have. So I think thinking about different kinds of approaches to this and different economic models or nonprofit models that could handle it, I think that's the kind of creative thinking that we definitely need, and that hopefully people are trying, even if more state level. Like the Texas Tribune is a great example. They're one that's totally web and that is really good and covers state politics really well. And I don't know why they've been able to be successful, but they have. And even state, like it doesn't always have to be at the city level to still, I mean, state politics is like the most hidden. I feel like so many nefarious things could be going down at the state level and nobody would know, because there's no media level equivalent for most states. So yeah, I think these other kinds of models are a good thing to think about.
Okay. And then so another question is about when national coverage does get local. And so what do you think about national coverage when it does cover very local issues like school boards, for example, which, that's something that's been in the news lately?
Yeah, I mean, so the problem, I think, and this is a generalization, but most of the coverage I've heard of school boards from national news is when some people on a school board either were getting their lives threatened because they either would or wouldn't do something with masks or mandates or vaccines or something, or wouldn't open or close the school. And so the news story is basically parents screaming at these members and threatening them in one way or another. And like, that's the focus of the story. And it doesn't have to be that, but usually it's something outrageous. Like if it's going to make it to the national news. There are a lot, like there's good coverage of local stuff nationally though, when, for example, disasters hit. they'll cover, and of course that's a sensational thing, but the coverage provides positive benefits because it reminds whoever the presidential administration is, they better get over there and, stand there with their sleeves rolled up, or they better, do this or authorize this emergency funding or whatever. So national coverage of local stuff can bring good. It's not that. It's just that it's usually covered for a specific reason, and in the political sense, it's usually something that's more like Texas has been in the news a lot nationally, but it's been when we've had like a new law that a lot of people think is extreme pass. And so we're like taught about, like they tell the story like we're the, wild Texans again, like what we've done now, So it might still be the same, causing the same issue, even though the focus is local, it still might be partisan if the national news is covering it. Because it's going to cover these more noticeable examples that are kind of outliers.
Okay. So even when national news is sort of ostensibly covering local issues, it's through this nationalized lens.
Probably not always, but a lot of the time, I think so. I think it depends, right? Like on the nature of the issue, but I think a lot of the times, yes.
Yeah. Okay. And the next question is about a little bit on the consumer side. And so could you talk more about the underlying issue, or one of the underlying issues of media literacy as it plays out with this issue of polarization? Why do stories that focus on sensationalized content or receive the highest number of clicks become the most popular, or the most frequently duplicated? So is there something on the consumer side in terms of media literacy that can help with this?
Yeah, I mean, so people have argued for this for a long time. And the problem is, well, I'll say two things. One, there is some evidence that when people know the way the media works, like if they know that underlying economic model, they are way more like savvy as news consumers. They're way more like, oh, you're putting this story up because it's going to attract a lot of attention. And so people are kind of more sophisticated. They don't believe as much. They sort of like, think, okay, media, you're doing that. So there is something about educating people about the institution and how it works that I think can help block some of what maybe the effects would be. On the other hand, there are some things that media literacy training or digital literacy training, whatever, can't help, because it's a cognitive bias that we're born with as humans, right? So like we're drawn to negativity. We are, it's the same problem of when you drive past a wreck on the freeway and you shouldn't look, you don't want to look, but something is like trying to make you look, some part of your human nature. And I think those things are much harder to, even if you're trained out of them, or people try to train you out of them, it's just difficult. I mean, some of these biases that we have cognitively just towards, things that grab our attention, it's part of our nature, and it's hard to get away from that, I think.
Okay. And as sort of an extension of that is just as individual news consumers, what are the things that we should be aware of when we engage with news that some of this research shows to maybe try to be a little bit more savvy or less of a contributor to the problem? And we talk about the systematic things, and so obviously this isn't something that's going to be solved by individual action, but what are the things that individuals should take away in terms of how they can consume news in a better way?
I think it's not about how they consume news. I mean, talk about things we can control. I think people need to try to interact with people that are not like them politically. Like, know your friends and neighbors, and don't you can still try to avoid talking about politics, but if you interact with friends and neighbors or community members on a interpersonal level, and know that there are different kinds of partisans out there, and they're not all these extreme versions that we see doing these things and saying these things on these commercials or in a news story on, you know, the evening broadcast. If we're reminded of the regular people that happen to also follow a party, I think we could be better at not always pulling those stereotypes into our heads. I mean, Dan, you might know that whether that's right or not more than I do. But that's at least what, like in the book, the Barry, John Krupnikov and John Barry Ryan book, they sort of say that that's one of the major problems. So I feel like if we could get away from having our stereotypes reinforced all the time about parties, then it might help. And that's actually easier to fix than trying to fix the whole media system or journalistic training or, you know, all these other things that we can't really change, at least in the immediate short term.
Okay. And so this is this is a short question, but apologizes for being horribly complicated, but it asks, how do we create news with better nuance?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question, actually. It's a huge problem because, so in political science, one researcher basically created a typology calling episodic versus thematic news stories. And when news stories have some context to them, people are way better able to apply it in ways that help them hold leaders accountable and like know who to blame and who to give credit for, and to understand that there are like sometimes historical processes that generate something instead of whatever the one-shot version of the story would tell you. So again, it's kind of an audience problem. Like I think news producers and editors and publishers worry that too much contextual information is going to be off-putting for the audience. There's mixed evidence about that though. Like, even though we know people like outrageous stuff, we don't really have good evidence that people are dissuaded with more context and relevant information. I mean, so I don't know how to, I think the problem is convincing maybe the people who make the news about that the benefits gained are probably there, and there's probably not as much risk to providing that context as they think. So maybe we could do some better testing of those differences and show them the evidence. Like, I mean, real kind of like media type testing, like they would have consultants do. We could do it on websites even, so that it wouldn't have to be that expensive. So maybe consult with them more, but show them evidence. This is part of what I think Talia Stroud tries to do with her. She has a Center for Media Engagement at the University of Texas. And I think she tries to do this kind of testing to maybe not on exactly that question, but she's trying to partner with news outlets to help them learn things like, what are the things that do and don't make people click away from the page versus click and stay on the page? But she's trying to help them find healthier things that will let people stay on the page.
Okay. So we're getting towards the end of time, and so if there are any more questions, you can throw them in the Q&A, but I'll just start with a closing question that is a little open-ended, but there's a tendency in when we project into the future to sort of assume that trends will continue as they are. And so the future will just be the more of the same, more of the same direction. Is this trend towards sort of nationalization and the sort of slow or maybe fast death of local news? Is this just going to continue? Do we end up with just national news outlets of various flavors, or are there things that might interrupt that? If the news environment looks different than that in 2030, what has happened?
Oh man, that's a great question. I mean, I don't think we're locked in necessarily, because people are trying to innovate with different ideas, but also people are really sick of social media and they don't trust it anymore. And like one thing we learned during COVID was that, I mean, they still didn't quit losing revenues really, but news attention at the local level was up. More people were reading papers, more people were watching local news because they knew they needed to know the community level information. And so I wonder, like, if we continue to experience things like health and safety, you know, risk level things that are lower level, regional and local, you know, maybe the value and sort of necessity of local news is just going to keep on showing itself to be really important. And then I also know that lawmakers even are working on like different bills to try to shore up. They recognize that the problem, a lot of them. And so maybe there'll be some sort of help from the government or regulatory something that sort of helps at least stop the hemorrhaging somehow. I know less about what those different policy levers might be, but I think anything would probably be welcome at this point from the standpoint of the journalists anyway. So things like that, plus the Jeff Bezoses of the world, these kind of independent owners that can afford to take a hit profit wise. If more people are willing to step forward and do that, then as long as they sort of keep true to a model that, you know, looks like professional journalism, but they can try to innovate with different things and they don't mind not having a profit for a while, those models would also help.
Yes, I just want everyone to, you know, to join me in thanking Professor Dunaway and Professor Myers for this really fascinating conversation. And I also want to thank all of you for being with us this evening or this late afternoon. So I just want to wish everyone a good evening and thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.